In the annals of history, rulers have burned cities, slaughtered enemies, and spilled blood to secure power. But rarely has a sovereign chosen starvation as her weapon, not for conquest, but for vengeance. This is the story of an empress who ordered her enemies not to be killed, but to be forgotten. No food, no aid, no escape. When advisors begged for mercy, she responded, "Let them eat memory." And when the gates of the city finally opened, weeks later, even the rats had vanished. Who was this empress? What pushed her to such cruelty? And how could a nation still worship her name? Today, we travel back to a forgotten chapter of imperial ruthlessness, a tale where silence became a scream and hunger was used not as punishment, but as proof of absolute power. The sun rose slowly over the sprawling empire land, veiled in incense smoke, gold-threaded robes, and ancient whispers. This was not Europe, not the courts of Versailles or the palaces of Vienna. This was the East, where divine right was more than politics, it was the will of heaven itself. The empire stretched vast and wide, ruled from a capital where silence held more weight than thunder. Its ruler, the Empress Dowager, sat behind layers of painted silk and ritual, untouched by the wind of rebellion or reason. No one saw her eat, no one saw her age, but everyone felt the weight of her gaze, even if it never left her private chambers. At the time, the country was a puzzle of contradictions, ornate, yet fragile, disciplined, yet teetering. The court was a nest of ceremonial venom. Eunuchs whispered lies for profit, concubines plotted through tears, and warlords smiled as they sharpened daggers beneath brocade sleeves. And above them all sat one woman, cloaked in stillness, commanding without raising her voice. She had not been born to rule. She had clawed her way into the heart of power, first as a low-ranking consort, then as mother to the emperor, and finally as the force behind the throne. By the time she was truly in control, entire ministries feared the flick of her fan. The empire itself was bloated with bureaucracy and paralyzed by formality. Reforms were whispered but rarely acted upon. Famine struck the countryside like lightning, fast and fatal. Bandits roamed roads once patrolled by imperial troops. But no tragedy could overshadow the throne's image, which remained polished, serene, and utterly ruthless. In the south, a provincial city known more for its stubborn pride than its size, refused an imperial decree. The offense was minor, at least to outsiders. A local governor delayed a shipment of grain that was meant for a festival honoring the empress. It was likely bureaucracy. It may have even been an accident. But to the woman on the throne, it was an insult, a public humiliation cloaked as oversight. This was not an empire where one simply said, "Sorry." To question an order, even passively, was to challenge the divine will. And in this empire, the divine had a name. The empress didn't call for soldiers. She didn't send assassins. She simply issued an edict. No caravans were to enter or leave the city. Trade was suspended. The granaries were sealed. Aid was blocked. The city wasn't stormed, it was starved. And as weeks turned to months, the people of that city, merchants, scholars, mothers, monks, began to learn what it meant to defy a monarch who did not need armies to kill. She only needed time. By the time news of the siege reached other parts of the empire, it was already too late. The empress hadn't just sent a message, she had carved it into the bones of the hungry. This was the world she ruled, a world where silence meant survival, and obedience was not requested, but required. And it was only the beginning. In this empire, obedience was not earned, it was demanded. The system didn't just reward loyalty, it destroyed defiance. Titles, lands, and even breath itself were gifts from the throne, and the empress made sure everyone remembered it. The woman who ruled from the jade halls of the imperial palace was not merely a monarch. She was considered the living embodiment of heaven's will, divine, unquestionable, untouchable. And for anyone who dared cross her, the laws of man would not protect them, because in her court the law bent to her mood. Ministers who offered unwelcome advice vanished overnight. Entire families were stripped of status, wealth, and sometimes their names literally erased from scrolls, gravestones, and memory. A single poorly timed comment could lead to exile. A suspicious glance could lead to execution. No trial, no appeal. But the true cruelty of her regime wasn't in swords or prisons. It was in control, calculated, psychological, and absolute. She didn't raise taxes on her enemies. She stopped sending grain. She didn't banish disloyal cities. She ordered the roads around them closed. No merchants allowed in, no peasants allowed out. Trade halted, markets dried up, and slowly, like a snake tightening its coils, starvation set in not with fire but with silence. When the city of Liang dared to defy a royal edict, they expected a show of force, perhaps troops, perhaps a decree, but none came. Instead, one morning, they awoke to find that their supply lines had gone dark. The imperial granaries stopped sending shipments. Caravans were turned away by border guards. Villages nearby were warned. Anyone helping Liang would share its fate. At first, the city resisted. They rationed, they prayed, they hoped the silence would pass. But days turned to weeks. The elderly began collapsing in the streets. Children's cries grew weaker. Dogs and birds disappeared from alleyway Seaton. Food riots broke out. Some tried to flee, only to be cut down by imperial patrols guarding the exits. The Empress said nothing. She sent no soldiers, issued no orders. She didn't need to. Everyone knew this was her will, and everyone knew what it meant. This wasn't just punishment, it was a demonstration, a reminder that in her world, rebellion didn't bring death by blade, it brought death by forgetting. The people of Liang were not executed, they were erased, and no one dared speak for them. Inside the imperial court, courtiers whispered behind silk fans, terrified they might be next. Ministers who once held influence now bowed lower, spoke softer, avoided even the suggestion of dissent. Because in this Empress's world, power wasn't loud, it was silent, patient, and terrifying. And her most devastating weapon was hunger. It began with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that follows desperation. In the city of Liang, no bells rang, no children laughed, no merchants shouted prices in the square. The streets were too empty for noise. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. What had once been a proud city lined with red-tiled roofs and shrines that echoed with incense and prayer was now a carcass. The Empress hadn't attacked Liang with swords or fire. She had simply waited, and hunger did the rest. Every day, the sun rose over thinner faces. Bones sharpened beneath skin. Mothers dug through trash heaps for seeds. Fathers sold the last of their tools for a handful of moldy rice. Then the tools were gone. And then, so was the rice. There were rumors, whispers, that in some homes, people had begun to boil leather shoes, grind bark into powder, and chew candle wax just to feel something in their stomachs. There were worse rumors, too, the ones no one dared say aloud. At night, the city's alleys filled with shadows, not thieves but the starving. Their footsteps were slow, their breath shallow, their eyes empty. Sometimes a body would be found in the morning, curled beside a closed granary door, fingers bloodied from trying to claw it open. The government officials inside the city, once proud in brocade robes, now grew gaunt and quiet. They sent messengers pleading letters to the capital, asking for mercy, forgiveness, or at least a sign. None returned. Inside the forbidden city, the Empress Dowager sat in her private garden, surrounded by chrysanthemums in bloom. A servant read her one of the letters aloud. She listened without blinking, then waved her hand. "Birds make noise when they are dying," she said softly. "Let them." Even her closest advisors were unnerved. One dared to suggest that continuing the siege might tarnish her legacy. She stared at him, her fan motionless. "Legacy," she repeated. "A river does not ask the rock if it may pass." He never spoke in her presence again. Meanwhile, Liang continued to unravel. Temples once filled with prayer now held the sick and dying. Markets became morgues. In desperation, the city governor ordered grain stores to be opened. But the supplies had already rotted drats, and worms had beaten the people to it. Then the unthinkable began. Reports spread of families disappearing overnight, off the strong preying on the weak, doors barred shut from the inside. A fire started in the western quarter as neighbors fought over the corpse of a cow. The people begged the governor to surrender, to send another message to the throne, promising lifelong devotion. He refused. He knew the Empress. He had once served in her court. He knew this wasn't about submission, this was about erasure. There would be no forgiveness. So they waited and died. By the end of the third month, 1 in 4 residents was dead. The rivers around the city ran clearer, fewer people were alive to draw from them. The once thriving city became a map of ghost houses, cracked windows, and silent temples. Then one day, without warning, the siege lifted. The guards vanished from the roads, caravans resumed movement, the granaries outside the city opened. But the Empress never gave an order. She never announced mercy. She simply stopped. As suddenly as the punishment had begun, it ended. When imperial messengers arrived weeks later, they found a city unrecognizable. Families had buried loved ones in shallow graves marked by broken tiles. The mayor's palace had become a shelter. The local temple bells, untouched for months, rang for the dead. The Empress received their report in silence. She took a single sip of tea and asked, "Did they learn?" No one answered. She never spoke of the city again. But in the palace, her message was clear. No throne was safe from her gaze. No city too distant to feel her hand. And no one, no matter how loyal, was beyond punishment if they tested her will. The people of Liang didn't rebel. They didn't rise in anger. They bowed deeper. They prayed louder. Because sometimes fear doesn't spark revolution. Sometimes it becomes faith. When the city of Liang reopened its gates, it did so without fanfare. No banners, no drums. Only the shuffle of hollow footsteps and the whisper of wind against cracked roof tiles. The silence inside the city was deafening, more eloquent than any rebellion. Across the empire, rumors of the starvation spread like smoke, but no one spoke them aloud. To utter the Empress's name alongside the word famine was to court death. Even in the scholar halls and government chambers, the incident became something ghostly, referred to only in metaphor, buried in vague records under terms like the silent lesson or the southern forgetfulness. But the people remembered. They remembered the weeks of hunger, the sickness, the missing neighbors, the smell of decay clinging to temple walls. And though their tongues stayed still, their eyes changed. Every time a new edict came from the throne, the citizens obeyed faster, not because they respected the Empress more, but because they feared her completely. The court changed too. Ministers who had once debated policy in long-winded sessions now kept their comments brief. Decisions were no longer questioned, they were executed. No one wanted to become the next Liang. The city had become a warning carved into imperial history, though never officially acknowledged. There was no monument, no poem, no royal decree of regret. But something else happened, something more enduring. The starvation of Liang shattered the illusion that the empire's order was benevolent. For centuries, the court had presented itself as the harmonious center of civilization, a balance between heaven and earth. But after Liang, people whispered a different truth, that harmony could be enforced through hunger, that divine rule could wear a mask of serenity while hiding a blade made of bone and silence. And yet, paradoxically, the Empress's popularity grew. Among the nobility and inner palace, she was admired for her strength. She does what must be done, they said. She keeps the empire whole. Among foreign dignitaries, she became a symbol of mystical power, an iron-willed sovereign cloaked in tradition and cruelty, feared even by her own people. Some peasants even offered prayers to her likeness in household shrines, not out of love, but in hopes of avoiding her wrath. To starve a city, and still be adored such, was the paradox of her reign. What survived was not just fear, but submission woven into the empire's very structure. After Liang, cities didn't rebel, governors didn't hesitate. If the Empress spoke, the land bent. But for all her power, there were cracks. Behind closed doors, a new generation of thinkers, poets, and officials began to whisper, "If a ruler must destroy a city to maintain order, what kind of order is that?" The story of Liang became a forbidden parable shared in coded poems, painted in shadowy ink scrolls, hinted at in ghost stories told to children, "Obey the wind, or the rice will vanish." And in the centuries that followed, long after the Empress was gone, the fear remained, not as memory but as instinct, a reflex passed down like a scar. Because what she did was not merely rule with cruelty, she reshaped the very definition of power. What kind of ruler starves her own people not, for survival, not for justice, but simply to remind them who holds the power. It's easy to look back and say, that was then, we're different now. But power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it withholds, and sometimes, like in the story of the Empress, it lets suffering speak in its place. The tragedy of Liang is not just a story of cruelty. It's a story of fear, weaponized, of silence used as a blade, of a people so terrified they bowed even as they died. And perhaps most chilling of all, it worked. The city didn't rebel, the court fell in line, and history, for the most part, forgot. But ask yourself this: what does it say about us, about any society, when obedience becomes more important than survival? When the people revere the very hand that takes food from their mouths? Centuries later, her name may have faded, but her method endures. In every regime that punishes disobedience with deprivation, in every system that hides cruelty behind order, in every silence that follows injustice. And so we end not with judgment, but with a question. If fear can build empires, what kind of future does it create? Because behind every monument, every law, every throne, there's always someone making a choice. She made hers, and an entire city starved to prove her right. What will we choose? In the next episode of Dark History, we may step into the shadows of a forgotten queen whose death sparked a holy warrior, a warlord who raised an army of orphans to seize a kingdom. Subscribe, comment, share. The darkness runs deep, and we're just getting started.